The knock came just as the widow was setting the kettle back on the stove. Hard, sharp, like it had been hitting the door for hours and she hadn't heard it. She froze, hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her house had been empty for months. Empty, except for her and the quiet that pressed against the walls. She waited. Then again. Knock, knock. Short. Measured. Persistent. She shouldn't open it. She told herself no. She had no food. No fire to spare. She had barely enough for herself, and what she had belonged to the memory of someone gone. Still, something pulled her to the door. Something that smelled like fear. Or maybe desperation. Maybe both. She opened it. Two girls stood there. Bare feet on cold dirt. Thin coats hanging off them like paper bags. Their eyes were wide, wet, certain. One of them, the smaller, had a red scrape across her cheek. The other's hair hung in tangles down her back, swaying in the wind, clinging to her collar. They said nothing at first. Just stared, waiting, and she knew they were testing her. Measuring her like she was the one begging. She shouldn't answer. She said it out loud. "I don't have food." The smaller girl stepped closer, a hand shaking. "Anything," she said, voice brittle. "We'll take anything." The older girl glared at her like she was challenging her. "You shouldn't be here." The younger girl's eyes filled. "We know," she whispered. The widow swallowed hard, her chest tight. She wanted to shut the door. She wanted to tell them to go. She wanted to tell them they weren't safe. But the air between them was colder than her stove. Colder than the blanket she had tucked at the foot of her bed. She knelt down, retrieved it. Thin, frayed, but warm. She wrapped it around them together, holding the ends tight. The girls didn't fight. They leaned in. Shivering, hungry, their bodies clinging to heat like it was salvation. And maybe it was. The blanket smelled faintly of her, of the house, of wood smoke and old laundry. She watched them, saw their faces pressed together under it, and felt something crack inside her chest. Something she hadn't felt in years. "Sit," she said. Her voice was low, uneven. The girls obeyed without question, curling on the floor. She went to the pantry, opened it. Empty jars. A half loaf of bread. A tin of beans. Not much. She set it before them anyway. They ate fast, desperate. She watched, heart hammering. She remembered her own hunger, years ago, when she had knocked on doors with her mother and been turned away. "Slow down," she said. "It won't disappear if you take it easy." "It runs out," said the older girl, scarfing the bread, eyes darting. "What does?" "Kindness," the younger said. She paused mid-bite, looked up at the widow. "People stop caring when you wait." The widow felt heat rise in her chest. She wanted to tell them it wasn't true. That some people did care. That she did. But she couldn't say it. Not yet. She only watched them, and listened to the scraping of teeth against bread. And then, the smaller girl hummed a tune. A slow, trembling song that sounded impossibly familiar. It was her mother's song. Not exactly, but close enough to shake the widow's memory loose. She froze. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. The older girl looked at her, noticed her staring. "You know it," she said. She stopped. She didn't know if she should tell them. Didn't know if she could. She remembered the songs her mother used to sing, the lullabies that carried her through storms, through hunger, through nights that smelled like smoke and death. She remembered. And for a moment, the house felt less empty. A sound outside broke the spell. The sheriff's truck, slow and deliberate, headlights cutting across the dirt. The widow's stomach dropped. She wanted to hide the girls, but she had nothing to hide behind. The blanket. The blanket covered everything they had. And maybe everything she had left to protect. The knock on the door was different this time. Not the small, desperate tap of children. Not the wind. The sheriff's voice cut through the walls. Evening. His eyes scanned the yard, the porch, the girls huddled together. They didn't move. He stepped closer. He always smelled of bourbon and iron. He looked at the blanket. His hand brushed it without asking. The girls flinched. He didn't see. Or maybe he did. You seen anyone? He asked. No, she said. Short. Flat. Honest in its fear, dishonest in its truth. You sure? He leaned in, narrowing his eyes. This far out, people don't just wander. I said no. She turned back to the stove, pretending she hadn't noticed the way he looked at the girls. Pretending she wasn't shaking. Pretending the kettle wasn't whistling too loud, like it was about to explode. He laughed. Headlights faded, engine dying. The house went quiet again. The girls kept eating. The smaller one's hand kept fumbling with the edge of the blanket. She traced the frayed stitching with her fingers. It smells like home, she said. The widow didn't answer. She didn't know if it was her home. Her home had died the day she lost him. The house itself felt haunted. Floors groaned under memory. Walls pressed in with the silence of all the people who had walked through and left. And yet, the girls. The blanket. She felt herself exhale for the first time in months. Where did you come from? She asked. No one, said the older girl. Nowhere. We went where the roads led. Why? Because they left us. Who? They all left, the younger one said. Eyes wide. Even the people who said they'd stay. The widow said nothing. She only went to the pantry again, checking the jars. Not much left. Not much at all. But she had this. She had the fire still warm. She had the blanket. She had this moment. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep them alive another day. The older girl reached out. Will you let us stay? The widow knelt, brushing dirt from their coats. For tonight, she said. That's all I can promise. They didn't argue. They didn't hesitate. They crawled closer, pressed into the blanket. Shivering. Waiting. Safe. She watched them, chest tight, mind racing. She knew the sheriff would come back. She knew the men in the trucks would watch from the roads. She knew this house, this blanket, this fire, might not be enough. But it was something. Something that belonged only to them right now. Something warm. Something alive. Something to hold on to. The kettle whistled again. She let it scream. The girls hummed together, matching their voices. Not perfectly, but enough to shake the silence. She had forgotten this sound. She had forgotten hope. For the first time since the last winter took everything from her, she felt it. Not loud. Not perfect. But enough. Enough to hold, enough to promise herself she wouldn't turn them away tomorrow. Not if they knocked again. Not if the sheriff came back. Not if the world outside the walls tried to tear them from her hands. She would hold them. She would hold them together. And tonight, the blanket would be their kingdom. The girl slept curled together under it, and she watched, her hands resting on the frayed edges. She listened to their breathing, shallow and unafraid for now. Outside, the wind moaned. The door rattled once. She flinched, but didn't move. Outside, the world was still waiting. Inside, for one night, the blanket kept them warm. The widow whispered to herself, low, almost inaudible. Sleep. Just sleep. And for a while, they did. Morning came quiet. The girls were still asleep when she rose, the blanket heavy across their shoulders, arms wrapped around each other like it was the only thing holding them together. She stood at the sink, listening to the house breathe, to the groan of boards and the scrape of wind through broken shutters. Her hands trembled as she filled the kettle again. She thought of the sheriff's eyes from last night, the way he had brushed the blanket, the way he had looked right through them. She wanted to hide it, the blanket, the girls, herself. But there was nowhere to hide in a house so small. She poured water into the pot, set it on the fire, and the whistle began to rise. The smaller girl stirred first, eyes cracking open. She blinked, tracing the blanket with one pale hand. "Warm," she said. Voice hoarse. "I know," the widow said, moving to the pantry for bread and the tin of beans left from yesterday. She didn't ask what they wanted. It didn't matter. Anything would vanish in minutes anyway. The older girl sat up next, hair falling over her face. "We can leave," she said. Eyes sharp, accusing. "If you want." "Do you want to leave?" the widow asked, setting the bread on the table. "No," said the smaller one. "Not yet." The older one hesitated. Then shook her head. "We stay." The widow nodded. She poured water into a chipped tin mug, stirred a spoon through beans. "Eat," she said. "Before it gets cold." The girls ate fast. They didn't speak at first. The smaller one kept fiddling with the blanket's edge, tugging it tighter around her shoulders, trying to pull more warmth from it. The widow watched, chest tight, remembering when she had clung to her mother's shawl on the porch steps, shivering through storms she couldn't name. "Your names?" she asked, after a while. "No names," said the older girl. Voice clipped, careful. "Why not?" "Names get taken," she said. "They follow names." The widow swallowed. She knew this. She had known it in the nights after her husband died, after her brother disappeared, after people said nothing. Names were dangerous. Names were proof. Proof could get you taken. She said nothing, letting them eat. The smaller girl hummed again, a low, trembling note. The widow froze. The melody scratched at her memory, a tune her mother used to sing before the world broke. She glanced at the older girl. The older girl's eyes were fixed on her. "You know it," she said. Maybe," the widow whispered, unsure. She didn't want to admit how much she remembered, how much she still carried. The girls finished eating. The widow rinsed the tin and set it aside. Outside, a crow cawed, wings scraping the cold air. The smaller girl pointed. "Look," she said. "There." A shadow moved across the yard. Not human, not entirely. She stepped to the door, heart hammering. Nothing. Just the wind. Just the crooked fence. Just the earth shifting. But the girls didn't move. They waited, alert. She realized then that the blanket didn't just carry warmth. It carried weight. Responsibility. Fear. Memory. And she felt it too. Heavy across her chest, heavy in her bones. "Don't go near it," she said suddenly. The well. She knew it was there before the girls did. Old, deep, dangerous. She had never liked the way it looked, the way it seemed to breathe in the dark. One girl's eyes went wide. "She's down there," she said, voice small but certain. "Who?" "All of them," the older girl said. Her fingers dug into the blanket, holding it tight, as if it could keep the past from rising. The widow shook her head. "No," she said. "Not today." But her voice trembled. She remembered the missing girls, the bones buried, the blankets left behind like warnings. She remembered the sheriff's stories, the whispers of families who vanished, of power and law that took and never gave back. She had tried to forget. Tried to build this house. Tried to live. But the well waited. The past waited. The girls didn't press further. They understood more than she liked. They huddled together, pulling the blanket around themselves tighter, their bodies trembling even as the warmth pressed through. She saw it then. They weren't just cold. They were haunted. And now, so was she. The sheriff's truck appeared again. Too early. Too quiet. headlights cutting across the walls. She cursed under her breath. He would smell the smoke. See the footprints. Ask questions. And she had nothing to tell him. Nothing true. She didn't even know if she could protect these girls from him, from the law, from the men who watched the roads like predators. Stay here, she said. Do not move. They obeyed. Of course they obeyed. They had no choice. But the older girl's eyes never left the door. She could smell danger. She could see it lurking in the light. The truck stopped. The engine died. Silence stretched, thick and tense. The widow felt the weight of the blanket shift. The girls had wrapped themselves around each other, holding on like it might save them. She swallowed and opened the door just a crack. The sheriff was there, tall, shadowed. He looked at the blanket, at the girls pressed under it, and his hand brushed it lightly, as if testing, as if measuring. Seen anyone? He asked. No, she said. Flat. Sharp. Defiant. You sure? He leaned in, eyes narrowing. People don't just wander out here. I said no, she repeated. He didn't push further. Not yet. He turned, muttering, truck engine roaring back to life. Headlights slanted across the floorboards before fading. The house was quiet again. The girls let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The smaller one tugged at the blanket, tracing the frayed stitching. It smells like home, she said. Maybe it is, the widow said softly. She didn't move. Didn't speak more. She only watched them, feeling the heaviness of the blanket, the weight of everything it represented. The past. Fear. Hunger. Protection. Hope. She realized then that warmth could be dangerous. Not just for them, but for her too. It tied her to them in ways she hadn't reckoned. The girls huddled, whispering, fingers fumbling with fabric, pressing faces close. The widow knelt beside them, letting her hands rest on the blanket. We have today, she said. Just today. The older girl shook her head. We need more than today. I know, the widow admitted. But today, it's ours. They didn't argue. They understood. The smaller girl hummed again, softly, a trembling echo of the melody that had haunted the widow last night. And this time, the widow hummed along, barely. Not loud. Not certain. Just enough to remember that memory could be shared, could survive. Could, maybe, protect. Outside, the wind rattled the boards. The well waited, silent and patient. But for now, inside, the blanket was enough. For now, the house was theirs. For now, warmth had weight. But it was not the only thing she would carry. The girls pressed closer, eyes heavy, breathing slow but steady. And she knew, as she rose to tend the kettle, as she listened to the house groan and creak, that the weight of the blanket was the weight of their lives now. And she would bear it. The truck's engine had barely faded when the widow heard it again. Not a knock this time. A doorbell-like echo from the road, faint, deliberate. She tensed, fingers curling around the edge of the blanket as the girls stirred under it. Stay, she whispered. The older girl's eyes were open already, scanning the yard like she could see the past reaching toward them. The smaller one clutched the blanket tighter, shoulders hunched against the chill. The widow went to the door, slow, careful. She opened it a crack. The sheriff was there. No engine. No lights this time. Just him, leaning on the frame of his truck, hands resting on the wheel like he owned the ground beneath it. The air smelled of dust and iron. His gaze was sharper than before, cutting across the girls huddled in the corner. He stepped closer without asking. His boots crushed the dirt quietly, deliberately, and she felt the old fear stir again. Seen anyone? His voice was low. Flat. Tested. No, she said. Quick. Hard. She knew she was lying. She had seen plenty. Just not the names he wanted to hear. You sure? He leaned in closer. Shadows bent across his face. This far out, strangers don't wander by accident. They don't, she agreed. Her hands itched for the stove poker, for anything to hold between herself and him. But she let them stay empty. She needed words first. The sheriff's eyes flicked down at the blanket, saw the girls under it. One hand brushed the fabric, lightly. Testing. Measuring. The girls flinched, barely. They had learned what hands could do, how they could lift, take, break. The older girl's fists clenched under the blanket. The smaller one froze, skin pale. Who's here? He asked. Not accusing, not quite. Just sharp. No one, she said. She kept her voice steady. She wanted to sound like she meant it. She didn't. He narrowed his eyes, leaning back slightly. You sure about that? I'm sure. Her mouth was dry, throat tight. She could smell him. Bourbon. Iron. Authority. He had the weight of the county, the courts, the law behind him. And she had only a house, a blanket, and 2 girls who weren't hers. Not many people say no to me out here. He stepped closer. Closer to the blanket. Closer to the girls. Closer to the line she wasn't ready to cross. You do. I have to. Her voice broke. She hadn't meant for it to. The air shifted. The sheriff scanned the yard. The fence sagged. The wind rattled through broken boards. He knew she was hiding something. He knew she always knew too much. But he didn't push. Not yet. Not fully. He backed away, muttering. I'll be back. Headlights cut through the morning, then vanished down the road. The widow closed the door, pressing her back to it, hands still on the frame. Her chest rose and fell fast. The girls peeked from under the blanket. He's gone, she said, though it didn't feel true. He'll come back, the older girl said. Voice quiet but certain. He always does, said the smaller one. She tugged at the blanket. Do they always come? Yes, the widow admitted. They do. The girls settled again, leaning into the warmth. But the house didn't feel safe. The walls groaned under the weight of unspoken rules, under the silence of neighbors who knew too much but spoke too little. She felt the blanket shift, heavier than it had been, as if it carried not just warmth but the responsibility of everyone who had ever walked these roads and vanished. She went to the pantry. Bread, beans, scraps. Enough for today. Barely. She set them on the table, letting the girls eat. The smaller one hummed again. She hummed the tune low, hesitant. The widow paused, listening. The song scratched at memory. The older girl noticed, eyes narrowing. You know it, she said. I do, the widow whispered. But that doesn't mean it's safe. Safe never comes, said the older girl. Not here. The widow didn't answer. She knew it. She had lived it. Power had a name in this county. It had a badge, a gun, a voice. It had rules that weren't fair. Rules that favored men who could trace their lineage back to land and law. She could see it now, in the sheriff's eyes, in the weight of the truck on her road, in the silence of neighbors. Power was a quiet predator here. And she was tiny, fragile. But she had the blanket. The girls. That was something. The smaller girl tugged at the edge of the blanket. What's your name? She asked, voice trembling. No names, said the older girl. She looked at the widow. We don't use them. They follow you, the smaller one said. They take you if they know. The widow nodded. She understood. Names were dangerous. Names were proof. Proof got you taken. She remembered all the families who had vanished, all the children who had disappeared into the quiet of the county, all the letters that had gone unread, all the warnings she hadn't listened to. Then we stay, said the older girl. No names. Just us. Here. Just us, the widow agreed. And she meant it. They ate in silence for a while, the kettle whistling quietly, the blanket heavy between them. Outside, the fence creaked. The wind rattled the boards. The sheriff's truck had faded, but his presence lingered like a shadow. The girls huddled together under the blanket, pressing faces close, drawing warmth not just from the fabric but from each other. She went to the window, watching the road. Empty. No headlights. No sound except the crow that had settled on the fence. She turned back to the girls. "He'll be back," she said. "I don't know when. But he will." "We'll be ready," said the older girl. "Ready for what?" "For him," she said. "For them all. For the people who think they own the land and the roads and the silence." The widow felt something shift in her chest. Fear, yes. But also resolve. The sheriff had a badge. But she had fire. She had the blanket. She had these girls who weren't hers but were hers now. And that counted for something. Outside, the wind moaned. The house groaned back. The girls tugged the blanket tighter. The widow knelt beside them, pressing her hands to the fabric. "We have today," she said. "That's all I can promise." "Tomorrow?" the older girl asked. "We'll face it tomorrow," she said. And she meant it. The wind rattled again. The fence sagged. The road waited. Power waited. But for now, inside, the blanket carried them. Held them. Protected them. And for now, that was enough. The smaller girl hummed a trembling note. The widow joined her softly. Not loud. Not perfect. Just enough to remember that safety could be shared, that warmth could be protection, that memory could be carried forward. The sheriff's shadow had left the yard. But the county, the power, the rules, they had not left. They waited outside like predators. But inside, the blanket was heavy with resistance. Heavy with hope. Heavy enough to hold 3 lives together for just a little while longer. The widow rested her hands on the blanket. The girls nestled closer. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. The weight of what she carried pressed down, but she bore it. She had to. For them. For herself. For the day that still waited, full of dangers, full of choices. Outside, the road stretched long and empty. The truck's engine would return. The sheriff's eyes would return. But the house was theirs, for now. The blanket held them together, holding back the weight of the world. And she would not let it fall. The sun had barely risen, but the house already smelled of cold and smoke. The blanket lay across the girls' shoulders, tangled and heavy, their small forms pressed into each other. The widow moved quietly to the stove, trying not to wake them, but the scrape of her boots on the floorboards was louder than she wanted. The kettle had cooled overnight, the beans left from yesterday now stiff and shriveled. She checked the pantry. Bread, a few scraps. Not enough. Never enough. She set it all on the table anyway. "Morning," she said. Her voice was soft, careful. The older girl stirred first, hair falling over her face, eyes narrowing as if she could already smell the world's danger before it arrived. "Food?" she asked. "Not much." The widow placed the scraps before them, trying to seem indifferent. "Eat it while it lasts." The smaller girl's hands shook as she reached for a piece of bread. "It won't last long," she said. Voice small, brittle. "Nothing ever does," the older girl said. Her tone was flat, certain, like a warning. The widow watched them eat, fast, desperate. She remembered the same hunger in her own hands, long ago. The feeling of taking what you could before it vanished, of knowing you were always too late. Her stomach twisted. She had barely eaten herself, too afraid the food would disappear before she could touch it. "Slow down," she said. "It won't vanish if you take your time." "It runs out," said the older girl, shoving a piece of bread into her mouth. always runs out. What does? The widow asked. Kindness, the smaller one whispered, eyes on the table. People stop giving if you wait. Her chest tightened. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell them that wasn't true. That some people did care. That she did. But she couldn't. Not fully. She only watched them, listening to the scrape of teeth on dry bread. She felt the weight of the blanket shift, heavier now, pressed around both girls like it carried more than warmth. It carried responsibility, fear, and a quiet accusation. A sound outside made her flinch. The wind? A crow? Or the sheriff? She couldn't tell. The house was full of noise, but it all sounded like warning. The older girl straightened, alert. Did you hear that? Nothing, the widow said, though her pulse raced. The smaller one pressed closer under the blanket. It's here, she whispered. Not yet, the widow said, voice low. She wanted it to be true. She needed it to be true. But her eyes flicked to the window, to the road, to the spaces outside the porch where shadows lingered longer than they should. They ate in silence after that, each bite careful but hurried, hands clutching scraps as if someone could take them mid-chew. The widow tried to think of something else. Anything. She thought of the well behind the house, deep and silent. She thought of letters she had found in drawers long ago, marked with official seals and signatures she could barely read, warnings no one had listened to. She thought of her husband, gone years now, and of the emptiness he had left behind. And she felt the hunger in the girls' bodies echoing in her chest. Why did you come here? She asked finally. No one else would take us, the older girl said. Voice tight. We tried. They sent us back. Sent you back where? Anywhere but home. Her eyes darted to the widow. Home's not safe. Not anymore. The widow didn't answer. She knew that feeling too well. Power wasn't in the sheriff, not really. It was in everyone who stayed silent. In everyone who turned away. In the families who had lost children and said nothing. She had tried to make a home here. She had tried to keep it safe. But now, with the girls under the blanket, she realized safety was fragile. It could crumble under a badge, under a law, under a whisper from the road. The smaller girl tugged at the frayed edge of the blanket. It smells like home, she said, voice trembling. Maybe it is, the widow said softly. But she wasn't sure. Not fully. She only knew it was the only thing between them and the world outside. Outside, the fence creaked. Boards shifted. The air smelled faintly of iron and dust. She could hear the wind through the cracks in the walls, carrying the quiet threat of the sheriff's return. And then, a sound that wasn't wind. A footstep, distant but deliberate. Her stomach dropped. They're watching, said the older girl, already on her feet, peering through the cracks of the blinds. They always do, the widow said. Her voice was calm but brittle. She wanted it to be calm. She wanted the girls to feel safe, even if she didn't. The smaller girl's hand clutched hers under the blanket. Will they take us? They can try, the widow said. But not today. The girls pressed closer, eating faster now, driven by hunger and fear. The widow watched them, feeling every motion, every tremor. She remembered nights when she had been alone, waiting for something to knock at her door, waiting for someone to decide she wasn't safe. She felt it all again now, through the girls, through the blanket, through the house itself. Hunger wasn't just empty stomachs. Hunger was memory, fear, and the weight of the world pressing in. The kettle whistled. She ignored it. There was no time for tea, no time for comfort. Not yet. She had to think, had to plan, had to hold the line between them and the road outside. Do you always come here? Asked the older girl, voice low. People? Trucks? Yes, the widow said. She looked at them both. They wait. They watch. They test. Why? Power, the widow said. It doesn't belong to anyone who should have it. It belongs to the people who take and keep quiet. The girls nodded, absorbing it. Not understanding fully, but understanding enough to fear. Hunger and fear made them small but alert. They were alive because they had learned, because they had survived. And she had learned too. Survival wasn't kindness. Survival was taking what you could, holding what mattered, and facing the rest later. They finished the last of the beans. Silence settled in the house. Heavy, thick. The widow went to the stove, lifting the kettle, pretending to pour tea for herself. She watched them. The older girl's eyes never left the window. The smaller one tugged at the blanket, folding it over her shoulders, over her knees, over her fear. "We have today," she said. Voice low. "Certain. That's all we have. Today." "Tomorrow?" asked the older girl. "Tomorrow," the widow said. And she meant it. The wind rattled the boards. The fence sagged. The road waited. But inside, the blanket held them together. The house breathed, groaned, and waited too. It was a fragile moment, but it was theirs. Hunger could make noise, but warmth could speak louder. The girls hummed softly, a trembling echo of yesterday's tune. The widow hummed with them, just enough to remember memory could be shared, safety could be claimed, and hope could be held, even if only under a frayed blanket. Outside, the world waited. Inside, they had warmth. Inside, for now, that was enough. The girls slept late that morning, tangled together under the blanket, but the widow did not. She moved quietly through the house, hands brushing the walls as though she could feel the memory soaked into the boards. Every floorboard groaned like it remembered her father's voice, her husband's footsteps, the silence of neighbors who knew too much and said too little. She went to the window, staring out toward the edge of the yard where the old well had waited for decades, its dark mouth hidden behind weeds and shadow. She shivered. The well had always been dangerous. Not just because of its depth, but because of what it held, what it remembered, what it swallowed. One of the girls stirred, the older one. She rose, blanket dragging behind her. "The well," she said, pointing. "It's here." "Yes," the widow said. Her voice was soft, trembling with a memory she couldn't quite place. "It waits." The younger one pressed close to the blanket, clutching it around her shoulders. "What's down there?" "Things we don't want to know," the widow said. But the words tasted like lies, even as they left her mouth. She remembered bones hidden under earth, letters never delivered, names taken and never returned. The well was part of it. It had been part of this land before her, part of the people who disappeared quietly, the ones who had been forgotten. She had tried to forget it too. Tried to fill the house with warmth, food, and fire. But it waited, patient and dark. "Can we see?" the older girl asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flicked to the widow, waiting for permission. "No," the widow said immediately. But she knew the sound of curiosity when it lived in the bones of someone who had already survived too much. She knew the girls would go, even if she said no. She swallowed hard, chest tight. "Not yet." The smaller one tugged at the blanket. "It's calling," she whispered. Voice trembling. "It wants to know." "Don't listen," the widow said. But the wind carried the sound anyway. A hollow, low echo, like something moving in water. Something alive. The girls froze. She could see the tension in their small bodies, feel it in her own chest. Fear wasn't the worst part. Anticipation was. It pressed against the walls, the floor, the ceiling, like it could squeeze the air from the house. The older girl stepped closer to the widow. "You went near it before, didn't you?" "I had to," the widow said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "To remember. To know." "Remember what?" "That people leave," she said. "And some things don't come back." The girls exchanged a glance, a silent understanding of the danger they couldn't name. Hunger, fear, the weight of their lives pressed against them like the blanket did now. The widow knelt beside them, hands resting on the fabric. Today, she said, we stay inside. We keep the blanket close. We keep each other safe. The older girl nodded, but she kept looking at the well. Something about its shadow, its dark mouth, called to her. It's empty, she said, though the doubt in her voice betrayed her. Empty, the widow asked. For now, the girl said. But it waits. The widow's stomach sank. She remembered the last time she had looked down that well, decades ago, the way darkness had swallowed sound, swallowed light, swallowed hope. She had seen shapes in the water that should not exist, reflections that weren't hers, whispers that weren't spoken by anyone she knew. And still she went back. She had to. Because memory demanded it. The smaller girl tugged harder at the blanket. I don't want to go, she said. Her voice was small, fragile. You don't have to, the widow said. She tried to sound certain. Tried to sound like a guardian against the dark. But she knew that fear alone would not keep it away. The older girl stepped closer to the well, brushing the weeds aside with careful hands. She looked down. The darkness seemed to lean toward her, patient and expectant. It's empty, she said again. But I can feel them. Who? The widow asked. All of them, the girl said. Voice barely audible. The ones who were taken. The ones who weren't strong enough to hold onto the blanket. The widow felt her throat close. She remembered names she hadn't said in years. Faces she hadn't seen in decades. Bones buried in the soil. Families silenced. And now these girls, alive, pressed under the blanket, carried weight that wasn't theirs alone. Step back, she said. Not another inch. The smaller girl whined, tugging at the blanket, shaking. Why is it here? Because the past doesn't leave, the widow said. Her voice cracked. Because some things aren't done. Because power doesn't stop. The girls huddled closer, the blanket heavy across them. Fear pressed against the walls of the house, pressing against the widow's chest. She could feel the well calling, pulling at memory, pulling at blood, pulling at all the things she had buried. She knelt, pressed her hands to the floor, listening. The house groaned under her weight, the floorboards protesting the silence. Will it take us? The younger one whispered. No, the widow said. She wanted to believe it. She had to believe it. Not if we stay here. The older girl's eyes were fixed on the well, unblinking. But it wants to, she said. It waits for the weak, for the quiet, for the people who forget it exists. The widow swallowed hard. She had seen enough to know it was true. The well did not forgive. It did not forget. It did not move fast, but it waited long. Longer than the sheriff waited. Longer than the county waited. Longer than the neighbors who watched from windows waited. It was patient. Merciless. Eternal. Then we keep the blanket tight, she said, pressing her hands against the girl's. We keep each other safe. And we do not look down. Not now. Not ever, if we can help it. The girls pressed closer, trembling, clutching each other and the blanket. The wind rattled the boards, carrying a hollow moan from the well that echoed like memory itself. The widow felt the weight of it, heavier than the blanket, heavier than hunger, heavier than fear. It pressed into her bones, into her chest, into the memory of everyone who had ever stood here and faced the darkness. You hear it? The older girl asked. Yes, the widow whispered. But it cannot have us. The smaller girl buried her face in the blanket. Promise? I promise, the widow said, even though the promise felt fragile, like smoke slipping through fingers. She wrapped her arms around them both, pressing the fabric tight. The well waited outside. Shadows waited. Hunger waited. And the county waited. But inside, under the blanket, they were safe, at least for now. The sun climbed slowly. The house groaned. The girls slept again, worn by fear and hunger, the widow watching, heart tight, listening to the silence of the well and the weight of memory pressing against her from every side. She did not move. She could not. She only held the blanket, held the girls, held the fragile thread of safety that stretched between them and the world beyond the yard. Outside, the fence sagged, the wind howled, and the well waited. Inside, the blanket held them together. For now, that was enough. The widow hadn't touched the drawers in the corner of the room for years. They were heavy with dust in memory, the kind of weight that presses down quietly, waiting for hands brave or desperate enough to disturb it. The girls were quiet this morning, wrapped in the blanket together, eyes wide as she approached. "We need to know," the older girl said, voice low, urgent. "They can't have everything without us knowing." She froze, hands hovering over the first drawer. She had hoped she could ignore it, pretend the past was buried. But the well behind the house had reminded her that memory doesn't stay down, that some things wait. The younger girl pressed closer, tugging at the blanket. "What is it?" she asked. "Letters," the widow said finally, voice trembling. She slid the drawer open. The paper was brittle, yellowed, edges curling. Seals cracked, ink faded. She lifted them carefully. Names. Dates. Addresses she hadn't looked at in years. Her fingers shook as she ran them through her hands. Some names she recognized. Some she had buried in memory, tried not to remember. And one name, stamped and repeated, made her chest tighten so hard she thought she would not breathe: the governor's family. "They took children," the older girl said, reading over her shoulder. "All of them. From everyone who couldn't fight." "Yes," the widow whispered. And no one spoke. She lifted one letter, ink smudged and illegible. "They used law to hide it. Used silence to make it permanent. And we stayed quiet. I stayed quiet." The younger girl's eyes filled. "Why?" "Because fear is heavy," the widow said. Her voice cracked. "Because survival makes you look away." "Not us," said the older girl. "Not now." The widow pressed the letters flat on the table. Each one carried its own weight, like bones pressed into paper. The girls leaned closer, clutching the blanket tighter, drawing warmth and courage from it. The older girl's hand hovered over the documents. "They thought they owned everything," she said. "The land. The roads. People. Children. Like we weren't even alive unless they said so." "They tried," the widow said softly. "And some succeeded." She thought of missing families, of graves never marked, of neighbors who didn't look, didn't speak, didn't fight. She remembered her own husband's family, the ones who vanished quietly. She remembered the well. The weight of memory pressed into her chest. "They can't have us," the older girl said. Eyes hard. "Not this time. Not under this blanket." The widow nodded. She understood. She had spent years learning that survival wasn't about bravery alone. It was about cunning, patience, timing. And this moment, these girls, this house, this blanket, was all she had to fight with. And maybe that was enough. The smaller girl tugged at the frayed edge of the blanket. "Will they come?" "Yes," the widow said. She didn't want to admit it. "They will come. And when they do, we need to be ready." The older girl leaned back, eyes on the widow. "Ready for what?" "Ready for them," the widow said. "For anyone who thinks they own the land, the law, the silence. For the people who took what wasn't theirs and kept quiet about it." "They lied," the older girl said. Her voice was soft, sharp. "They said we'd be fed. They said we'd be safe. They lied." "Yes," the widow said, pressing her hands on the blanket. She could feel the girls' tension, their small bodies trembling under the weight of history. "And some still do." The letters trembled in her hands. She unfolded one fully, eyes scanning lines of faded ink. Orders, permissions, signatures she had long known were corrupt. She had read them before, but not like this, not with the girls here, watching. Every word was a key, a confirmation of what she had feared all along. That power didn't care for life, for safety, for warmth. Power only cared for itself. They think a badge and a name makes them untouchable, the older girl said. Her fists clenched under the blanket. They think silence is enough to hide it. And it is, the widow said quietly. Until someone remembers. Until someone holds the blanket. Until someone refuses to look away. The smaller girl's hand pressed against hers. We'll remember, she whispered. Yes, the widow said. And we'll act. The girls leaned into her, pressing close under the blanket. The letters lay between them, brittle and sharp, a tangible reminder of the past. She felt the weight of them, heavier than the blanket, heavier than hunger, heavier than the fear outside the walls. A knock sounded at the door. Sharp. Precise. The widow froze, heart hammering. The girls pressed closer. The older one's eyes narrowed. He's back, she said. Yes, the widow whispered. She placed a hand on the blanket, pressed it down over them. And we don't answer. The knock came again, louder. Forceful. The sheriff's badge, the truck, the county, they were all here now, waiting for obedience, waiting for silence, waiting for fear. She pressed her lips together, hands clenched around the edge of the blanket. She could feel the girls trembling. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down, of stolen lives, of silence, of stolen children and unmarked graves. They can't take this, the older girl said. Her voice low, hard, resolute. Not this blanket. Not us. No, the widow agreed. She lifted the letters, pressing them against the chest of the older girl. Remember this. Remember them. And hold tight. This is what they tried to hide. This is what they took. And it belongs to us now. The girls pressed closer. The blanket shifted, heavy with warmth and history and determination. Outside, the world waited. Authority waited. Silence waited. But inside, they had the letters, the blanket, and each other. The sheriff could knock. The county could watch. Power could try. But they had memory. They had truth. They had warmth. The knock came a third time. She ignored it, fingers pressed into the fabric of the blanket, hands trembling. She could hear it in the hallway, the scrape of boots on boards, the weight of authority pressing against the walls. She whispered to the girls, low, steady. Remember. Hold tight. They cannot take this from us. The older girl's hand hovered over the letters. We'll need to burn some, she said. Hide some. But we keep what matters. Yes, the widow said. What matters stays with us. The smaller girl buried her face deeper into the blanket. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, the widow said. But we're here. We're together. And that makes us stronger than they know. The house groaned. The wind rattled the shutters. The world outside pressed close. But inside, under the blanket, pressed between brittle letters and trembling hands, they had warmth. They had memory. They had each other. And for now, that was enough. The widow looked down at the girls, pressed the blanket tighter around them, and whispered, We survived this. We hold. And one day, they'll answer for what they took. Outside, the sheriff waited. The county waited. The past waited. Inside, the blanket held the weight of all of it and more. The house smelled of smoke before she even touched the matches. The letters lay on the table, brittle and yellowed, every signature a weight, every line a claim of power she hadn't known she still carried. The girls pressed close under the blanket, eyes wide, small hands clutching the fabric. The older girl's jaw was tight. You're going to burn them? Yes, the widow said. Her voice was flat, steady. Her hands shook, but the resolve under it was heavier than fear. It's the only way to make them stop having power over us. The smaller girl clutched her knees, head buried in the blanket. Won't they know? They'll know we remembered, the widow said. And that's enough for now. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying the faint scrape of boots on the dirt road outside. She felt the sheriff's presence long before she heard it, a shadow pressing through the walls, through the boards, through the air. He was always patient. Waiting. Testing. She could almost feel the badge against her skin. But she held the letters tight. She held the blanket around the girls. She would not look away this time. Light it, the older girl said. Voice low, dangerous, certain. Show them fire doesn't lie. The widow struck the match. The flame caught the first letter. Edges curled, smoke rose, and she felt a tremor pass through the house. Not fear. Something else. Relief? Defiance? She didn't have time to name it. The letters caught one by one. The pages twisted, blackened, crumbling into ash. The girl's eyes widened, shadows reflecting in the flickering glow. Why are we doing this? The smaller one whispered, trembling. Because they took what wasn't theirs, the widow said. Because silence protects them. Because fire is a kind of truth. It reveals everything. The older girl nodded. And it burns their lies. Outside, the wind picked up. She could hear the truck stirring, tires crunching over dirt. The sheriff's shadow pressed against the boards again, closer now. She felt the weight of authority like it could push the walls down. But she didn't stop. The letters turned to ash. Smoke filled the room, curling around the girls, around the blanket, around her hands. She coughed but kept striking matches, kept feeding the fire, letting it speak the truth that silence never could. The smaller girl whimpered. They're going to be mad. Let them be mad, the widow said. We're done being afraid of them. The sheriff's hand slammed against the doorframe. The truck's engine roared somewhere down the road, a warning. The widow dropped the last letter into the flames. The fire roared back, hot and alive, crackling like it had teeth. The girls held on tighter, pressing into the blanket. She pressed her hands to theirs. We survive this, she said. We hold together. We show them that warmth, that memory, cannot be taken. Are we safe? The older girl asked. Not yet, the widow said. She could hear the scrape of boots on the porch, the shadow moving closer, but she did not falter. Fire was defiance. Fire was memory. Fire was now. The sheriff's voice cut through the smoke. Step away from the fire. Sharp. Flat. Commanding. I won't, the widow said. Not a question. Not a plea. A statement. She met the shadow's gaze through the doorway, saw the badge glinting in the weak morning light. Not this time. Not ever. The older girl stood now, hands on her hips, blanket pulled around her shoulders. You think we're afraid of badges? You think that gives you the right to take what isn't yours? Don't make me, the sheriff started. The widow stepped closer, holding the fire between herself and him, the smoke curling around her like a shield. We've learned your rules, she said. We've felt your power. But we've also learned that truth burns brighter than any badge, any law, any lie. The smaller girl whimpered again, but there was a tremor of something else in her voice. Courage. Awareness. It's ours, she said. This blanket. This fire. We hold it. The widow nodded. She dropped the last ember onto the floorboard, letting it die slowly. Ash and smoke filled the room, covering the letters, covering the lies, covering the weight of authority that had pressed against them for decades. The girls pressed closer. The blanket shifted, heavy and protective, full of warmth and defiance. Go back, the widow said to the shadow at the door. Take your badge, your truck, your law. We won't stop the world outside. But inside, fire is ours. Memory is ours. The truth is ours. And we will not hand it over. The sheriff's hand lingered on the doorframe, hesitation for a moment. The engine